Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong, GitLab, and Google Cloud. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions for our panelists, we want you to submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. That's also where you'll find the chat tab. We want you to engage with us there. Let us know your thoughts or concerns, anything you have to add to our conversation today. We will also be having 3 polls throughout today's webinar, so keep an eye out for those as we want your participation there. And at the conclusion of this webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. Our topic today is Shift Left, Balancing DevOps and Infrastructure Security. And I'm joined today by Jonathan Hunt, VP of Security at GitLab, Nima Beatty, Global Vice President of Alliances at GitLab, and Vijay Gandhi, Head of Security of Google Cloud Products at Google Cloud. Thank you, Jonathan, Nima, and Vijay for being here with me. But Nima, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Oh, thanks for having us here. And Cody, I know that we're going to have a couple of polls coming at us. Please remind me when we should probably break and remind our audience that we're going to have a poll. Also, we have a chat panel and a Q&A panel on the right-hand side. So feel free to ask questions if you've got anything that you're burning questions, something you want to know about, something you've been curious about, or just a chance with our audience members and our presenters. This is a great opportunity to ask those questions. All right, so why don't we just jump right in? Jonathan and Vijay, thank you for joining us today. What I wanted to do is just get a chance to have the audience get to know you a little bit better. And I was, noodling asking you a fun question like, give me 2 truths and a lie, or, what color is your parachute? But I really came up with just what's your superpower, given that you have such an amazing career and such a wonderful job. I think our audience would love to know, what is it you consider to be your superpower? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
So the superpower, so I'm going to take that both literally and figuratively. Figuratively, I would say I'm a huge Doctor Strange fan. I want to have some fun with this, and so everyone can kind of get to know a little bit more about us. So I'm a huge Doctor Strange fan. I would love to cheat and say I want all his superpowers. He's got like 17 of them or something. If I had to choose one, it would be time travel. That said, more literally, I think my superpower is the ability to juggle work, 3 kids, school, baseball coach, pianist, taekwondo dojo on the weekends. I try to do it all. I don't eat, I don't sleep, I don't watch TV. I haven't heard music since 1982. So that's a little bit about me. Vijay, on to you.
Oh my God! I can't beat that. Gosh, that's hard. So, if you ask my kids, I think they'll say that my dad jokes are the worst. Okay, so, and it seems to me if that is true, then I think dad jokes are my superpower. They are supposed to be terrible. So I think that's probably my superpower. But on a more serious note, I think what I enjoy doing. And I think I've honed my skill of connecting the dots, if you will, right? Had a pretty diverse professional background. So that background has allowed me to connect these dots often. So it's connecting security with data science, connecting neuroscience and psychology with, optimal experiences for SOC analysts. So this is what I try to work on. Not sure if it's a superpower, but I'm trying to get better at that. So not as good as what you're doing, Jonathan, but trying to get there.
This is great. Actually, it's great because it humanizes everyone on this call. We do have very difficult professional careers, but I think the home life is even more challenging and difficult, especially with snarky teenagers who don't appreciate the effort that goes into dad jokes or even parent jokes. Like collective groan around the dinner table when you say something that I don't think you're alone there. You definitely have company.
Thank you, Nima.
Well, hey, thank you for sharing that with us. Why don't we jump right into it? And I thought it might be worthwhile or just a little bit helpful to level set for our audience kind of your perspective on security, given that security means different things to different people. And we definitely have a very eclectic perspective to hear represented today. So Vijay, I'll start with you, and I'd love to get your perspective on what security means from your side of the lens, whether it be the operator or the infrastructure provider.
Right. So I think it's a broad question. Let me see if I can frame it in a simple fashion for me. Right. So when I think of security, I break it up into two parts. The first one is about reducing or shrinking the attack surface. Okay. And it's kind of thinking about it in terms of putting locks in place, right? The second part of this is then you manage the residual risk through your detect and response apparatus, right? So it's like the 1-2 punch in many ways. Now, in shrinking the attack surface, I think it's really, really important to be able to do that well, because the complexity of the attack surface and complexity of the threat landscape is not just vast, it is changing every day. So if you're able to shrink the attack surface, then you have a bounded problem to address in many ways. So the first part is becoming more and more important, as I look at security, especially in the cloud. And this kind of ties into where we are going with today's topic, and how security will increasingly become a team sport as against just the security team's job, right? So Jonathan and I, we have to work together to make security happen. It's everyone's responsibility. So I think that's probably where I would start. And then, I'd love to get, Jonathan, what your take is, then maybe we can riff a little bit on this topic.
Yeah, honestly, what's fascinating about this is, even from my perspective, so Vijay obviously addresses the infrastructure side. He's looking at it from the lens of an operator. On my perspective, let's say from the software side, or even from a developer's perspective, it is not very different. It is reducing the attack surface of the application and the software. It is risk reduction strategies. I would also say, though, that top of mind for me, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later in more depth, the top of mind for me is also threat intelligence, right? I think we need to be on the cutting edge of what's coming next. I think we need to be forward facing, not backwards looking. And what I want to do is make sure that my organization and my teams are set up or enabled to be successful in identifying the next emerging threats.
Got it. No, this is a wonderful perspective from both, and I think what I heard were two concepts. Vijay, I think you mentioned that security is everyone's responsibility, so it's not just one provider that's going to be the catch-all or panacea for everything. And then you also mentioned the idea of an attack surface being that an infrastructure attack might look very different than an attack during the development phase, where they might be slipping things into your code that you didn't even know about or needed to test, or might not even be a slip. It might have been, Jonathan, I think you'd mentioned this offline, was there are CVEs that are being discovered constantly and patches being added, but we're not very good at housekeeping of making sure that we have patched every single potential vulnerability in your software during the development phase. And since we tend to run pretty quickly, we may let a few things slip. So where, between the two of you, what's the intersection between, the developer responsibility of security versus the operator responsibility of security? And as an end customer, for example, how much should I anticipate will be taken care of for me versus what are the things I still need to be educated on?
Yeah, you want me to take that? Maybe Nima start.
Whoever wants to take it first.
Okay, let me do that. I think it's maybe some examples would help. Let's talk about shrinking the attack surface, right? I mean, that's an objective. And what's going on with cloud and modern applications, as an example, is that you have all these applications are distributed, right? There are serverless components, there are containers that have Emerald. All of these need to talk to each other now. And they have to talk to each other securely. You need management of these to be done securely. Now, what that does is creates a complexity around managing all those secrets, right? So secrets management has become an important component of shrinking data access. Make sure that you hold those secrets clearly, revoke them, appropriately. Now, that is a joint responsibility. So let's look at that construct. That's a shared concept that we need to work together as operators and developers. But developers have the responsibility of making sure that secrets are being managed appropriately. And the operators on the operator side have to make sure that if there is a deviation that's happening, if there are threat actors who use those secrets, then we have to be able to detect that at runtime in production, right? So the same concept, it's shared, but we have different roles to play. Developers have one role to play, and operators on the other side have a different role to play. So that's just one example. Jonathan?
Yeah, and honestly, another example really is about vulnerability management. So if you think about it from the perspective of the developer or even the operator within let's say an SRE or a database engineer, what we're doing is the traditionally the security teams are responsible for, we're going to go run our scans and we need to make sure we find all these vulnerabilities, and then you need to go patch these. It's almost like a race to the finish line, right? Like we have to find it before a malicious actor does, and that's just it's not a scalable approach. It's not really a fair approach. It's not fair to our customers. It's not fair, I think, to our organizations to believe that our security teams are going to find everything before nefarious actors do out once they've been publicly produced, right, or pushed out to production. So the developers do carry a burden. I will say it's a heavy burden. They're producing the code. They're writing the code. They're in some sense, right, the vulnerabilities are born from their hands. But on the other hand, like I'm certainly not trying to throw them under the bus. They need to be enabled to identify and mitigate those vulnerabilities before they get pushed to production, right? So that can be tooling, that can be education, that is with the help of AppSec engineers, that is with the help of the security organizations, right? So I think the intersection is we talked a little bit about shared responsibility. The intersection is that a process needs to exist that allows both teams to interact together to identify, detect and prevent vulnerabilities from being publicly produced.
Got it. No, this is pretty eye-opening. I think we're going to come back to this a little bit in the intervening questions. But what I'd like to do is maybe let me switch gears a little bit. Now, the topic for today is balancing DevOps and infrastructure security, and I think maybe we should have relabeled this balancing DevSecOps. And it seems to be a bit of a loaded term now. The sarcastic guy in me says, someone just took the word security and shimmed it between DevOps, has now created a completely new term, but nobody really understands what that means. I'd love to get your perspective on what exactly is DevSecOps and why did we choose to put security into a more traditional and well-understood domain? Does it make it better? Or is it really a response to the changing world conditions that are around us? Vijay, I'm going to start with you first.
Sure. I think one way to think about DevSecOps is to think about DevOps, right? Why was DevOps required? So I think to me, the goal of DevOps was to do innovation with agility and at scale. That is the fundamental goal of DevOps. And to do that, you have to do a set of changes in your tooling, in your culture, in your skill set, in your process, right? So that your CI/CD pipelines, a bunch of tools that come in, essentially help you achieve those goals of agility and scale, innovating with agility and at scale. DevSecOps essentially is analogous to that in my mind. It's about doing security with agility and at scale. Now, if you want to do security just like innovation with agility and at scale, you would need a similar set of changes in your culture, in your tools, in your processes, and your skills, right? So same set of things. Now, all of that essentially starts to manifest itself in ways that Jonathan was alluding to. As an example, the vulnerability management that he alluded to, the static analysis tools, the dynamic analysis tools, all of that tooling has to be part of your CI/CD pipeline, right? So that ties into left shift of things. Similarly, with DevOps, you have infrastructure as code. The idea of automating configuration, deployment configuration, so that you don't have errors, you can do it at scale. The exact analogy of that would be security as code, where policies are specified by security teams, and developers have the responsibility of codifying those so that they're part of your security as code movement, right? So I think one way to understand, in my mind, DevSecOps is to see it as an extension of DevOps, and injecting security is real. I mean, if you don't do that, all your digital infrastructure is at risk, and that obviously is not a state that we want to end up with. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Jonathan can.
And Vijay, let me ask you a clarifying question. So the thing I heard and I pulled on was the idea of making security much more transparent and auditable using GitOps concepts. So before, we used to have firewall settings in obscure XML formats that were stuck on the top of rack switch, which only a couple of engineers might actually know how to access. And by putting it on the top of the shelf, it was kind of out of sight, out of mind, but then we forgot what we had originally set up. Whereas if we store it in the same place we store our application code in Git and use the same control mechanisms to be able to view it, update it, audit it, that transparency lends itself to a greater bit of security, because now we know if something has changed and we have complete audit trail, right? Was that an accurate reflection of what you said?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I think that are, let me unravel those at least, right, that I see. One is, you're absolutely right. Security by obscurity is not security, right? So I think having clarity on and transparency on your configurations is important. And I kind of joke, if I'm old enough here to say this, but nobody ever deletes a firewall rule. You keep adding those up, and you have no idea how the whole thing works. At some point, you just are so worried that you don't go back. I think that kind of makes security very, very brittle and complex. So I think the idea of bringing transparency that you're saying is an important one. Idea that it allows everybody to be able to put their eyes on it, is important. So I completely agree with that part. But I think the larger point to me is doing it as code essentially makes sure that it gets consistently applied and is more error-free when you're doing it at scale, right? I mean, and at speed. So that agility and scale issue can essentially only be addressed through this kind of automation. And that's an important construct. Sorry, my lights keep going off. Let me just wave. Yes. Does that answer, Nima?
It does. And I thank you for the clarification. Some of us are not network security engineers or even in the security domain. And I feel like it's not learning just one language. It's like learning all 218 languages at once, because it is such a broad and deep domain to just get your arms around. And I definitely, as a former developer, a failed developer, let's be honest about that. I remember just learning one or two languages was hard, but then to learn all this other stuff, that's kind of difficult. Let's just be honest about that. This is a big challenge.
I think Jonathan, I do think we should talk about complexity, the nature of complexity in security, but we will get there, I guess. But Jonathan,
let's put a pin in that one, and I'll leave it in the chat as a potential question. Jonathan, so to you, in terms of the kind of the same question.
Yeah. So. I think Vijay did a great job explaining kind of like the evolution of DevSecOps and how security got embedded into it. To put it simply, for far too long, I think security has been an afterthought. Traditionally, we work to release software quickly. It's often plagued full of vulnerabilities. There's structural defects. There's compliance issues for the security team when they're trying to do their SOC 2 or ISO audits. And honestly, what this does is it has led to an increase in like breaches. Breaches, of course, impact businesses impact real people, right? And I think what we've seen now over the last several years is we, the customers, now demand more in companies that store our data. So DevSecOps really is more than this buzzword. It's really about producing a more secure product or service that's designed to significantly reduce the risk and increase the protection, right, of customers, company, and personal data. So there's a couple of like underlying thoughts there. One is and Vijay kind of touched on this too, is really we're trying to prevent or find security issues before they make it into production, right? And then what that has done is puts the burden on security teams to, again, like I mentioned before, to find it before someone else does. And what we found is that DevSecOps, I know a lot of teams and organizations sort of like struggle with the DevSecOps strategy. They sort of struggle with the speed. Everyone has the sort of like the nuance with DevSecOps is that we continue to claim that it helps teams move faster. It helps you produce code, more quickly and more securely. And it does. And it does because, the vulnerabilities that you find and fix before it moves into production, or find and fix immediately, is going to be significantly less time consuming than the vulnerabilities you find later that's now 3 releases down the road. Or that has led to something more significant, such as an incident, a breach, a compromise of the company itself. So it does ultimately produce more secure code and faster. It's also about automation. It's about tackling hard problems. Some of those are like configuration management, secrets management, which we dove in a second ago, is a hot topic. Composition analysis. We do a lot of this within GitLab itself. We build a ton of tools into GitLab, into the CI/CD pipeline, such as SAST, DAST, linting, fuzzing, compliance policies, and a ton of other tools, right? And that's helping our developers produce this code and getting it merged into production with all of these checks and balances in place, and us understanding the risk of that. We know, what vulnerabilities exist. We know the severity of those vulnerabilities. We know what dependencies are involved. We know what's not patched. We know what is, so it's providing a clear picture of the security of this software or this release before it goes out. And really the goal is not only to make us more secure, but it's really to make it easier for stakeholders in the development process to participate and share in that responsibility model.
Got it. No, this has been amazing, just the quality and the richness of the feedback. Now, I have to do my duties as the moderator to ask and involve the audience in a bunch of questions. So for our audience, I'd like to just have you go over to the right side panel and click on the poll button. We're going to open a new poll. The first question is, how would you rate your organization's ability to secure code? Oops, I just lost it. To secure code during development and deployment into a secure cloud. So we'll take a moment to allow the audience to chime in on that one. And then I'm going to come back to to you both and ask you a little bit of a tangential question here. Now, we kind of alluded to education beforehand. I'd love to get your perspective, and there's 2 parts of this question. One is, what can we do as operators, as developers, to get better educated in terms of, like, what do I need to learn? Like, if I'm a developer, do I really need to learn IAST and DAST, or is that a concern that I just hand off downstream to my security team? And as an operator, what are the things that I shouldn't have to worry about? Because technically the platform, in this case, Vijay, Google Cloud, does a great job of handling those security concerns for me. So it's a bit like it's all automated. I know it's a double-ended question, but let me just start with you, Jonathan, from the developer perspective of what we should do from an education.
Yeah, honestly, what I think we need to do is just have a good understanding of the code that we're responsible for. If you're programming in Angular, React, whatever, C, whatever it is that you're doing, right? Golang is very popular these days. Get a good understanding of Golang vulnerabilities. Get an understanding of the OWASP top 10. Get a good understanding of how to scan your code. Are there tools that you can use to quickly scan and identify vulnerabilities or defects within your code? And understand the process too. So it's not all on you. And I also this may be a fiery topic. I don't believe it's all on the security team either. We can't be everywhere at once. And it's not a one-to-one pairing. There's 500 developers, there's 10 people on the AppSec team, right? So it's not a one-to-one pairing. So we can't review all the code all the time. So I think it's about understanding, it's understanding that you don't have to be perfect, but continually striving to do better and to be more secure, because that one vulnerability could have significant consequences down the road that could turn into a much larger problem, especially if you work in like identity and identity access or authorization or something in with permissions, right? So I think it's about doing the best you can, continuously striving to do better, understanding who your counterparts are in the security organization, understanding how to gain access to that information, and understanding what tools you have in place to further enhance or complement your process.
And the underlying tenor here being that your security department is really a partner, not just a department of saying no. And I think if you understand their concerns and can make it into your development cycle, it'll be much better for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, and Nima, if I can touch on that just for a second, that traditionally people are like, security, geez, I don't want to go to them. I don't even want to raise my concerns because it's going to stop everything. It's going to halt production. It's going to, that's changing. At least I believe it's changing with some very, very, with the new security practitioners, the new security leaders. I think we're looking at this philosophically different, right? We need to be an organization to say yes with, or yes and, yes, if only we can do this, or we need to find a way to say yes to keep the organization moving forward, and only say no if we feel like it's going to lead to the ultimate breach, right? But we need to find a way to ensure that our development and our organization, even our infrastructure operators, to ensure that they can succeed in their work and not be stopped by security. We should not be a roadblock. We should be an enabler.
That's great. That's great. Vijay, I'm going to ask the same question of you, and then I'd love to get your perspective on representing Google Cloud and the fact that now we have programmable infrastructure as opposed to kind of do it yourself, build your own infrastructure. Which security concerns can we comfortably hand off to Google and say, I just don't want to be in the business of having to worry about this because Google Cloud already does a great job of this anyway, and that's the whole reason I'm running on top of Google Cloud.
Right. So first, I think I just did want to answer the first question on education. I think it's a very, very important aspect of security, right? I think developers becoming aware, really getting educated on security issues that security professionals, security team face is really important. Because only if they see the effects of their work or not work would they really understand how important it is. So if I had a magic wand, I would want every developer to think security just like they think, innovation and features, right? So they should be thinking about that as a first-class citizen as part of their goals, right? I think that's an important, and that will only happen with education and exposure. Developers should have a risk mindset, right? Understanding risk. And the reason I say this is the security landscape is complex for two big reasons. One is the attack surface is becoming massive and very distributed, right? Our IT infrastructure is in different clouds, it's on-prem. We have devices that people are accessing from everywhere. So it's just attack surface is supremely complex now, and IoTs, you put that into play and you have massive complexity. The second side of that complexity is the threat landscape. The attackers are becoming more and more creative. They're collaborating. They are very well funded, especially if you bring nation states into play. It is a formidable landscape there as well. Now you multiply these two big numbers together and you get a massively more complex thing. The only way we can do all of this is by collaborating, as you said. If attackers are collaborating, we should collaborate as well, and that's our only hope. So I think having that risk mindset is important. And developers getting educated about reducing the risk that we have in the system is going to be critical, right? And that I think will hope happen through education. So I think that is something that I am very passionate about, and we need to, Jonathan and I and practitioners like us spend a lot of time doing that.
Yep.
And that kind of dovetails into the Google Cloud question that you raised. And I will kind of abstract out of, I think, Google specifically, but speak in generic terms. I think the idea of handing off security, in my mind, again, doesn't exist. I think it's a question of shared responsibility, shared fate model, where you're collaborating with your provider, and jointly working to secure your stuff, right? So there are things that the provider would do, but there are things that you also have to do. I think somebody made a very nice statement. You can give work to somebody else, but you cannot give given the responsibility and ownership of it, right? So I think every business is responsible for its customers, their protection, their safety, so on and so forth. So while your vendors can help you, but it doesn't take away the responsibility in some sense. So I think collaboration is the operative word here, not just within the organization, but across organizations as well.
Got it. This is wonderful. I mean, it's like security is the paint, but you still have to know how to draw and how to use a paintbrush. That's great. I'm going to do another quick PSA for our second of 3 polls. This happens to be around your current organization's investments. Like, hey, what's happening at your organization? Whether you're involved in app modernization, or you are actively migrating to the cloud, or you're just building cloud native applications. Definitely share with us what your organization's currently happening at your organization, or is a priority. And we'll put that in the poll. We'll come back at the end of this and kind of revisit what the responses are. Just pulling on that thread around education and vulnerability, you kind of made an interesting statement, is that the attack surface is growing exponentially and it's supremely complex. And this next question is really to both of you. I remember listening to an NPR interview with Adrian Ludwig, who at the time was the director of security for Google Android, and there had been some sort of vulnerability. And one of the things he said was, look, there's always going to be bugs in software. There's always going to be some sort of like attack surface within your software, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's exploitable. And the example he gave was, imagine there's a wooden door that's unlocked, but that door is inside the vault at Fort Knox, right? So you still have to break into Fort Knox just to be able to open that door and walk into that vault. That's probably not likely and possible. Like, don't worry about those bugs. Worry about the other ones where you hadn't taken enough precautions. And I want to balance this with an alternate view of security from Justin Smith, where he talked about how hacking and security hacking is very much like playing a video game. If you leave the video game on all the time, you will eventually get good enough to get to that upper level. And the trick here is not to prevent hackers from playing the video game. It's to, intermittently turn it off. And so it resets them back down to level 0. And I think he primed us around the idea of 3 R's: repair, rotate, repave. How much of these concepts are becoming more commonplace in terms of there's some vulnerabilities we're just going to have to accept, and then there's going to be some security parameters where we're just going to have to leave behind the old world of antivirus and don't change anything and adopt this new framework of constantly adapt and adopt to change, because that's the only way to keep the hackers at bay. Bit of a loaded question, but Let me see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I think the first part that you alluded to, I think it's spot on. And this is where, in my mind, the idea of risk comes into play. And when I think about risk, I think about 2 things. One is risk is a way to bound the unbounded security problem, right? There are just too many things to do. So the way you prioritize what needs to get done is to look at risk. The second idea around understanding risk is it's simply the likelihood of something happening times the impact of if it were to happen, right? If that bad stuff was happening. So in your example that you gave, if that particular vulnerability is, inside Fort Knox, the likelihood is very, very low that will happen. So even if right? So the risk is really low. So I would not necessarily prioritize that, protecting that particular or putting a security control there. But I think the lens of risk is super important to bound the problem in this case. I'd love to hear what Jonathan has to say about it.
Yeah, so this could be interesting. So so here's where I diverge a little bit. So I agree and disagree with both of those statements, and let me explain. I do agree with the risk mitigating strategies. I do understand that we do have mitigating controls that reduce the CVEs or the severities of vulnerabilities. We do that ourselves within our own organization. There may be a CVE 10, but it's sitting on a dev server that's not even connected to the internet. Okay, so maybe we don't need to drop everything and go patch that today in place of fixing a CVE 7 that is publicly available or exploitable, right? So there is that thought approach. I do agree a little bit more with, I think you, Nima, did you say, I think it was Justin Smith's statement.
Yep.
I do agree a little bit more with that in terms of your product and software and services is continuously available on the internet as a cloud application. And the attackers have all the time in the world to try to find one hole, right? The biggest challenge with security is we're never going to eliminate risk or eliminate every vulnerability. The biggest challenge is that we have to be perfect, and they only have to find one bug, one fault, one hole, one defect, one vulnerability. They don't have to find one way in, and we have to stop all the ways of getting in. And it's just not reasonable to think that we're ever going to patch everything as long as we are literally plugged into the internet. So, but on the other hand, I also don't believe we can just reset that. I don't believe they can get up to level 17. We turn it off, turn it back on. Now they're back to level 1. Your service is your service. Your application is your application. You continue to evolve and patch things and fix vulnerabilities and release new code, which in itself might have additional vulnerabilities. So they walk away, they come back, they're still on level 17 potentially, right? Assuming you didn't patch that. So really what I'm most concerned with is security. I say all that to say this. What I'm most concerned with is lateral movement within the environment. I know we cannot fix everything all the time. I know at any given time we're going to have a vulnerability publicly exposed. And that said, and that's true of every company. And that said, I want to make sure that I have a defense in depth strategy. I want to make sure I have not only preventative controls, I have detective controls, I have incident response, I have logging and monitoring set up, I have a SIEM digesting all those events, doing threat analysis and correlation and analysis of those logs. I want to make sure that I look for IOCs. I want to make sure that I can detect when they're getting close to Fort Knox, when they're getting close to that door. Maybe where we have an unpatched CVE 10 because we thought we'll get to that later because there's 7 layers of defense ahead of that. So I treat it a little bit differently. I think about it a little bit differently. I always think about lateral movement. I think groups today are much more sophisticated than they were 10 years ago. I think groups are popping up. New groups are popping up each week. I don't think anything is off limits for Lapsus, Conti, Anonymous, all of those other hacking groups. And I think that if they want to get to something, they can get to it. It's just going to take time and expertise.
God, this is like I said, you're going to leave this webinar with a college degree in security, hopefully. It's just chock full of really great ideas. And talking about great ideas on thought leadership, I think this space is definitely getting its fair share of attention, not only just in terms of thought leadership, but a wealth of great ideas, wonderful new tools, big, bright, shiny new companies starting up in the security space. If I just do a light search on just internet security, I'm as a noob, I get kind of overwhelmed with all these thought concepts, like shared security models, shift left, software supply chain, security and automation, AI, ML. Eventually, the mind just reels. I was wondering if you could help us cut through all the noise to focus on really what matters. And Vijay, I think you kind of got to it when you talked about the risk mindset. And I'm wondering if I can reframe that in terms of what is the absolute lens of risk that as a developer, as an operator, as mutual entities, we should be looking at. And with that, what is, from your perspective, the biggest security concern today that we should all be aware of?
Right. So I think I kind of want to answer that, but in a slightly different way. I think security is complex, and this goes back to what we initially said. I do want to talk a little bit about complexity and nature of complexity in security. A lot of people say, "Hey, we should simplify security." I think it's a good goal to have, but not an easy one to attain. And I'll give you what I mean by that. I'll give you an analogy from physics, right? We didn't know how the world worked for a very long time, and then voila, Newton came along and he said 3 laws. That's it, and Newton's 3 laws, and we're able to make sense out of why things fall out of the sky, why everything goes around everything else, and so on and so forth, right? I don't think we will find Newton's laws for security. I think that's not the kind of complexity that exists. It is a lot of things together. So the way we will make it simpler is by many incremental steps, and all the names that we hear, all the concepts that we hear, actually are an attempt for us to simplify security, right? When we say left shift or shift left, essentially we're abstracting out a lot of geeky stuff that we do, so that we all can have a simple conversation around it, right? Say, hey, so shift left essentially is a way to try and simplify a lot of complexity. Unfortunately, it brings in a degree of, again, complexity because you're introducing new terms. That is the nature of, I think, complexity and security. We will continue to work at it, but it is just a complex topic that will not get resolved itself. So what would I tell practitioners? I would tell practitioners that use some frameworks like the one that we talked about, where you shrink the attack surface and manage residual risk. I think if you think in those 2 terms, it will bring some order to this chaos, right? There's similar frameworks around risk reduction. So you think in terms of likelihood of bad stuff happening and the impact of it. I think using these frameworks brings in some degree of structure to this inherently complex and vast topic. So I'm sorry, I don't have a silver bullet answer for anyone. I think all I'm saying is that we have to do the hard work here. We have to get educated. And over time, I think things become easier, but it will not just go away. At least that's my take on it. But I've never wanted to be more wrong. I do want to be wrong that there is a simple silver bullet to this.
I think you're right. It's not a bite-sized problem. This is definitely a problem that everyone within the organization really needs to lean into, and it's getting more and more complex on a daily basis. Jonathan, your perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Honestly, I'm with Vijay on this one. I take a very risk-based approach when I think about security. I have here at GitLab, we have a fairly good sized security organization for the size of the company that we are. I have 4 sub-departments. I have 15 teams, all doing different things. And how do you prioritize a vulnerability fix with a feature, a new security feature with, how do you prioritize, pen test versus, container hardening? It's a matter of really understanding the impacts to the organization, trying to assess like return on investments, trying to assess, you can throw some financials into it and kind of think about it from like a net present value perspective, not in terms of like money, but in terms of like, moving the dial forward on the security dashboard. Really, I think what's important is collaboration, I think, is key. Often, traditionally we have had the security leaders the heads of security or the heads of organizations have gone and just made decisions. And this is the direction we're moving. And this is the tool that we're using. And this is, the current OKR and objective or goal of the organization. And what we've kind of done is we've kind of detached ourselves from the individual the ICs or the engineers sitting at the keyboard working in the day-to-day. They're the ones seeing the problems. They're the ones working through the problems. They're the ones wondering why things aren't getting fixed or prioritized within the organization. It's causing a lot of stress. It's causing a lot of anxiety. And I think you have to meet in the middle. I think you have to openly collaborate with your teams. I think you have to have involvement from all different levels of the organization. Of course, I understand the engineers don't have the big picture. Well, I mean, us at the very top don't know what they're going through in the day-to-day either. So I think we have to have an open mind. We have to be collaborative. We have to be transparent. We have to agree to work together to solve these problems. And we have to be more cross-functional. I think far too long we've worked in silos. So the security organization has their objective and their OKRs, so we're going to go solve this problem, and infrastructure is going to go do their thing, and development's going to go do their thing. But what happens when I need infrastructure? What happens when I need development to go prioritize like security burn down for, the number of S2 vulns that we have or something like that, right? So what happens is everyone is so siloed and they have their own objectives and their own goals that they don't often cross-functionally work together very well. So I think we need to improve synergy across the organizations and have shared goals. And those shared goals, of course, kind of goes back to this underlying theme of like shared responsibility. We're in this together. Let's agree to go tackle a problem together that requires all of us.
Yeah, no, this is great. Like security really needs to have a spot at the table, and then it needs to be everyone's concern. It's a shared concern, not just one individual magically making everything right. Which was perfect time for us to have our third and final poll question. So let's move over to the poll and open that up. What's your organization status? So we're using DevSecOps. We're planning on using it in the next 6 months, or I'm not really sure if we're using it at all. Go ahead and submit your response. All right, wonderful. And then Cody, I was wondering if we can, on the poll side, we can leave all the responses open so that folks can see how we're all responding. And it looks like there's, actually, that's great. I'm looking at all the responses right now, and there's a wealth of wide variety in the responses. So there's no clear winners on any of these. Delightful. All right, let me come back to both of you. And Jonathan, before I have you walk us through kind of your experience of running a SaaS product on a public cloud that's always exposed to end customers and to the open internet, I was wondering if I can ask you both for one thing you want your practitioners to start doing and one thing you want them to stop doing as a key takeaway from today's webinar. Jonathan, I'll start with you.
I don't mind going first. So I'll try to keep this brief. I know we have a lot more to talk about. I think the one thing that I would want people to start doing, this is across the entire organization, is to increase your security sensitivity. What I mean by that is if you see something, say something. If you see we're using vulnerable packages or libraries in development, like notify somebody, let the team know. I'm not saying that doesn't mean you have to go fix it. It doesn't mean that the problem is necessarily on you. You can maybe it is on you. Maybe you can help with that problem. But if you see something, say something. If you see pervasive access to the database, let somebody know. Like let the compliance team know. Let the database team know. Take another look at that. Right. So the cold hard truth is, and I said this before, is that the security team is not omniscient, and we can't be everywhere at once. So it truly is collaborating together to improve security across the organization. I think the one thing that I would say organizations should stop doing, and this is for the sake of redundancy, is I said it a second ago, is stop working in a silo, right? Like let's have shared goals and objectives together to ensure that we're tackling the hard problems. What happens is we have all these massive backlogs of problems. The infrastructure team, has a backlog. The development team has a backlog. The security team has a backlog, and none of those ever get addressed, or they rarely gets addressed because it never gets prioritized, because we continue to have more goals and more objectives, and we're on to the next thing before we have fixed the last thing. And to some degree, we could probably touch on talking a little bit about maintenance or kind of like cleaning up messes or burning down, queues. But I won't get into all that. But I would say those are my two things.
Thank you, Jonathan. Vijay, you?
Yeah, so I think Jonathan did touch on things that I would want to change, but maybe I can just give pointed examples, taking a cue from Jonathan here. One specific change I would want, I think, development teams to start doing is to include security user stories as part of their agile process, right? So I think, so that is for them to develop empathy for the security side of the house, right? So what I would want the security teams to do on the other side is, not too far back, security reviews would take 3-4 months, 6 months, right? Whereas if you look at DevOps teams, best-in-class DevOps teams will release, their deployment frequency is on demand. They deploy multiple times a day. Their lead time to change is less than an hour, right? Their time to restore a service is less than an hour. So you're working with developers who are trying to achieve those kind of agility goals. So security teams have to understand that they cannot be, as you said, they cannot be the people saying no, and they have to figure out how to help automate security for the developers so that they can continue to move at the pace, as I said. So yeah, those would be two things, like security team understanding the need for agility, and the development team incorporating user stories in the DevSecOps, or agile process, if you will.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So I want to be mindful of time, and I know we only have 9 minutes left. Let's take a question from our audience, and one of our participants. I'm not going to mention the number because that's kind of odd. Participant 697 is asking, how do you and your teams and your institutions manage concerns that are cut diagonally across teams? For example, managing the intersection of institutional level firewall rules, plus operator access, plus monitoring, with the needs of the application developer. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it sounds like the question is, how do we serve multiple masters, or how do we solve the Thunderdome problem where everyone enters Thunderdome, but only one firewall rule can come out? Vijay, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I actually don't have a great answer here. I think which is specific. I think this ties into what Jonathan was saying. I think that we continue to have silos, and I think companies and organizations that are able to remove those silos by having processes that cut across these silos are able to solve the problem, right? So this is it. The nature of the problem is such, again, that it happens over time. As silos disappear, this becomes simpler. So yeah, I think there's no, in my view, there's no simple answer here. It's you keep getting better at it. It's like you cannot run a marathon, just because you decided one Monday morning, right? I think you gotta work towards it.
No, that's true. We're not all Dean Karnazes who can just put on some shoes and go running an ultra marathon. Jonathan, to you.
Yeah, I think there's two different ways to sort of approach that question. I think you have the people side and you have the technology side, and from the people side, it is challenging. We do, people need access. Let's just say, for example, people need access to the database. So you have developers, you have database engineers, you might have site reliability engineers, you might have CERT engineers or AppSec team members. You might even have to have customer support that might need to access customer data for the purpose of supporting customers. And I think what we try to do is, from a security perspective, is we can't prevent people from doing their job. We need to be successful. We need to support our customers. We need to continue to innovate and create and be competitive and differentiate ourselves from our competitors. So we have to continue moving forward as a software company. And so the best that we can do, and it's kind of like what Vijay said, there's not a super great answer to this, but I think what we need to do is, what we do from the security side is we heavily invest ourselves in entitlement reviews and routine access reviews. We also are creating ways to provide temporary access, essentially like tokenized access that lasts for 24 hours, where they can access the database to complete a function function or an API integration or something, or a call to the, a database call, and to get the data that they need. You also need to make sure that, you're limiting sort of like the least privilege model, right? I think is very important here. If they only need read-only access, don't give them read-write access. And I think the same approach sort of applies from the technology perspective. You think from like firewalls, right? Sort of like, what's the least privilege model, right? Do we open it up to that IP entirely, or do we specify port 53, right? And so I think it's about a continual process of review and remediation.
God, that's fantastic. So I know we're coming up on time, and the responses have been so rich, this discussion dialogue so fantastic, that I actually did not get through all the questions I had for you. So Jonathan, I apologize. I really did have a great question lined up about how you run GitLab.com. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so let me end this with my final question for you both, which is to ask for your prediction of what you think will come in this space by the end of the decade. It's a little future thinking there.
I don't mind going first. This is the end of the decade is better because Nima did taunt us with 200 years from now what would security look like. So I'm not sure I could answer that. I know VJ can, but I probably could not. So I would say there's two things. I'll make it quick. I think we're going to start seeing. And I'm super excited about this one, by the way. We're going to start seeing cross-functional blending of security practitioners. This is a change in the way that the security organization is currently structured and the way it works interoperatively within the organization. So I'm not just talking about counterparts, but like what you might almost call like forward counterparts, where security engineers are actually embedded and sit in infrastructure, and they sit in development and quality and IT. Now, I'm doing some of this today, but they do sit in security and report to me. And so at best, we're the counterpart. So there's an AppSec counterpart to the development teams. There's an InfraSec counterpart to the infrastructure org. But I think it's going to evolve where security practitioners are sitting across these teams and embedded in these teams. And they're part of the day-to-day. It's getting a seat at the table. They're going to those team meetings. They're in those sprints. They're participating in those OKRs. They're just part of that process. There's going to be a process about developing the feature, the architecture, all the integrations and the dependencies and the components and security. And it's just going to be a part of that. The second thing is, again, I promise to make this quick, is security automation not only will continue to increase, but it has to. It has to increase in order to scale with the increasing organizational sizes and cloud usage. But not just that, but also to keep up with the increasing threats and risks that we face each and every day. I know we see things like the public sector is heavily targeted, infrastructure, energy, things like that are heavily targeted. Well, that's only going to become more pervasive and more widespread as these let's say malicious actors. Let's say there's more to gain on the opposing side.
That's great, Jonathan. Thank you. And Vijay, to you.
Yeah. No, I think for 8 years is a good time. I really like that horizon. I think end of the decade. So I'm going to use the buzzword and actually go out on a limb and say it, right? So I think today we swim in data insecurity, but we actually don't leverage insights from data as much as we should be to protect ourselves. I'm going to say by end of this decade, we would be leveraging all the AI, ML technologies that can extract those insights from data to exactly do what Jonathan was saying, which is automate your SOCs. So I'm going to say we will have largely self-driving SOCs, right, enabled by AI, ML tech by end of the decade. So yeah, let's meet in 10 years and see if I was right.
I love it.
And there you have it.
I didn't want to steal your thunder, VJ. I knew you were going to talk about AI, ML, so I left it for you. But yeah, no, he's spot on with that.
That's fantastic. Well, both of you, Jonathan, Vijay, thank you very much. I want to thank you both. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. I'm hoping this has been an incredibly informative, fun, and truly thought-provoking discussion for everyone. We'll hope you'll join us for many more future webinars. As your host and moderator, this is Nima Beatty signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Jonathan, Nima, and Vijay, thank you all so much for joining our discussion, for sharing your expertise. I know a lot of brain power goes into it, so thank you so much for being here with us. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that this panel was recorded, so you should be receiving an email with a link to access that recording. You can also find the recording on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So I know we're all waiting for those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to be given away. Our first winner is Adrian B. Our second winner is Amit T. Our third winner is Lazek N. And our fourth and final winner is Carol C. So to the 4 of you, please keep an eye on your email to collect that gift card. And if you don't see an email, check your spam folder. I would like to also extend our gratitude to GitLab and Google Cloud for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks, as always, goes to you, our audience. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Please just take one extra moment to fill out a quick post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.